For participants who would like to hear the lecture in Bahasa Indonesia, please log in to Zoom through the link given by the organizers, and please click on Bahasa Indonesia on the interpretation link. Bagi para peserta yang ingin mendengar sesi hari ini dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan untuk melakukan login ke Zoom dan melalui link yang dibagikan kepada dia. Kemudian untuk para peserta yang tidak hadir online atau bisa memilih menu bahasa Indonesia pada fitur interpretasi. And now I'm going to introduce and share with you our sebagai. Mr. Brian Russell, in his current role as Chief Executive at the Office for Product Safety and Standards, Department of Business and Industrial Strategy, is leading the drive for better delivery of regulation in the UK, through building the national capacity for product safety. In his former role as CEO of Better Regulation Delivery Office, he worked to improve the business environment and promote growth by improving the way that regulation is delivered in the UK. We worked with local authorities and national regulators and aim to ensure that the voice of business is heard by the government. He also works with other countries who are interested in improving their inspection regime, including Indonesian ports. Mr. Russell, we can wait with your comment, please.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Very generous. And I'm very honored to be here today and speak to participants on the floor, both in the room and also watching online. And thank you very much for the opportunity for what I hope will be a conversation about the necessity of regulation. So I'm going to speak for a while, and I'm also hoping to be more questions and we can dialogue together. So I think we always learn from listening to each other. My proposal this afternoon is to demonstrate to you that regulation is not so much necessary, but also an asset. And I know that in your study of law, then the role of regulation is important, and I hope to show you that it's not negative. It's not something that should be squeezed and reduced, but it's something that should be owned and stewarded and celebrated as a good thing in our society. Often we think that law or regulation as and stops what is happening. I want to try and persuade you that actually regulation can something that enables good things to happen. So that's my proposal, and we'll see at the end of my persuading everybody. I hope so. So I should say first of all a little bit about who I am. I am the executive of the UK's product regulator, the Office for Product Safety and Standards. And my responsibility in the UK is to advise ministers on how we have good law for product regulation, safety, environmental human impact, and also how we deliver those regulations. I'm sure that this is to do what they need to do to comply with the law and keep them safe. And so we listen to business, we listen to consumers and citizens, and we seek to ensure that regulation works for them. That's the core of my job. One thing I've realized in Indonesia is I'm too short. If I couldn't get out of this sport, I realized this is the my apologies. And so that's my responsibility in the United Kingdom. And I was just going to speak how long is the journey to regulation reform going to take in Indonesia? And how long is it taking in the United Kingdom? And I said, well, there's two things to say. The first is that we haven't finished. It's a journey, but we're not at the end. The United Kingdom is not perfect, and I mentioned in my lecture more than one example where we have made mistakes and we continue to make mistakes. Because you learn by making mistakes as long as you don't repeat them. So learning from mistakes is important. But if you want a date for when we started a reform journey in the United Kingdom, it is 1948. Now, I don't think there's anybody in this room who was alive in 1948. No? No. You said I've got 20 years experience. You're being very generous. I actually started as a regulator in 1986, which makes me very old. However, the UK had already been working on regulatory reform for 40 years when I started. In 1948, our Ministry of Industry said, we are going to set light to unnecessary regulation, we're going to create a bonfire, we're going to set business free without the shackles of regulation. And ever since then, we've been trying to work out how to do that. And I think there are loads of key things along the way I have to share with you. But one of the things is, it's not a short journey. And I know it's easy, you've been working on these things for some time. I know you're making big progress, but it's not a short journey. And myself, I started in 1986 when I had got a job. I was at university and I got a degree in economics, and someone said to me, what do you do with your life? I said, well, I quite enjoy doing nothing. They said, you better get a proper job. So I started to train to be a regulator, an inspector in a local authority. The equivalent, I think, is a district. So I had a small batch. I had a set of 800 laws I was responsible for, and a number of businesses and a number of consumers, and what I said to do my job. And I worked in that for a number of years, and I prosecuted companies, and I helped consumers, and gradually I started to learn that those things didn't really work. And I would say that in that part of my career, I learned that it's not enough just to have good law, you've also got to have good delivery. And good delivery is not simply about prosecuting or enforcing, it's about understanding and it's about changing behaviour. The fundamental job of a regulator is to change behaviour. When government passes a law, any law, it is because government has decided that the current practice is not consistent with the desired behaviour. We want people to drive slower. We want people to wear crash helmets. We want food to be safe. We want houses to be strong. We've decided that something in current practice is not aligned with what we like as society. So we pass a law, and we say this law has changed behaviour. Now, does anyone believe that passing a law changes behaviour? Anybody? I'll give you an example. This is a good example from the UK. You can laugh at it, but it's a true example. In the UK, there was an incident where a child was bitten by a dog. Okay? It happened. It never happens in Indonesia, but it happened in the UK. And the media started reporting stories of children being bitten by dogs. So every day in the media there was a story.
Now, were more children being bitten by dogs now than before? No. But the media had this story, and it became an event. Does this happen in Indonesia, that sometimes the media gets hold of something and makes a story? Never. But in the UK, it happens all the time. And so government was persuaded to pass a law. And we passed a law, and it's called the Dangerous Dogs Act. And it's about the behavior of dogs. Now, unfortunately, dogs do not understand legislation. They do not read the law. They do not know that their behavior was supposed to change. So the Dangerous Dogs Act was passed. Government had done its job. Hooray! We have a new law. Hooray! Everything changes. No. In fact, there were more incidents of dogs biting children after the law than before. However, we had a new law and all was fine. And this makes the point. Passing a law does not change behavior. Passing a law simply creates the infrastructure under which change can happen. But the change happens because people decide to change. So the job of the regulator is to encourage that behavioral change. So why doesn't that work? And I think there are 3 myths that I wish to suggest to you that stop everything just going simply. Otherwise, it will all be finished. So I want to suggest 3 myths, and maybe you believe these myths, and maybe you think I'm wrong to say they are myths. I will leave that to your judgment. The first one is that everything gets regulated. So a lot of people think all goods are safe because someone tests them. All food is safe because someone tests it. All aircraft will fly because they are tested. All doctors are safe because they are being checked every day. Everything is being done. And a lot of people believe that. Maybe you believe that. The truth is that regulators do very little. They work hard. I worked hard. They work hard. But how many inspectors are there in Indonesia? Let's say there are 100,000. That's a lot, isn't it? There are 240 million people in Indonesia, and every day they all do 1,000 things. So that's 240 million things happen in Indonesia every day. So even if there's 100,000 regulators working, the vast majority of those things are never tested, are never checked. And in fact, there's good evidence that says if they were checked, the outcome would be worse because people assume if someone else is checking it, they don't need to do it. So actually, we do not regulate everything. We regulate some things, we inspect some things, we enforce some things, but most things are never checked. So if you think that regulation is going to keep you safe, it's going to keep you protected, it's going to create a better environment, it ain't going to happen. That's the first thing. The second thing is that inspectors believe that an inspection changes something. They believe that more inspections lead to better behavior and that if they inspect things, it will become better after they've inspected it. Do you believe that? I'm afraid the evidence says that actually that isn't true. There's a wonderful PhD thesis by a friend of mine called Florentine Blanc, and he compared the number of accidents in factories between France, Germany, and the UK. And he compared how many inspections there were over time with how many accidents there were over time. And what he discovered was that fewer inspections were also associated with fewer accidents. So it looked like inspections were actually increasing the number of accidents. Now, that's not true. That's a false causality. However, there was no evidence that inspections reduced accidents. What reduced accidents was empowering businesses to control their environment, to keep their workers safe, to think about the precautions they were taking, and to invest in the things that were going to protect people. Now, if an inspection causes those things to happen, it may well lead to better outcomes. But an inspection itself, simply going around looking at things, does not in itself make anything better. There's a phrase in English, you don't fatten a cow by weighing it. In other words, just because you get your animal and you weigh it, doesn't make it any heavier this week than it was last week. You don't make it bigger just by inspecting it. You have to do something to change. You don't just achieve it by inspection. And then the third one, just to really wind up the lawyers in the room, is that deterrence does not motivate anybody. So all of our laws in all of the countries I've ever been to, they say, do this or we will do that. And the assumption is that that will deter you from your behavior. Drive at the speed limit or we will stop you. Wear a crash helmet or we will prosecute you. Do these things deter people? And the evidence is that they don't. People are not motivated by deterrence, and particularly business is not motivated by deterrence. There are some aspects where it can have a marginal impact, but generally speaking, people are motivated by what comes from within them, their values, their beliefs, their desire to be part of community and to support community. That's what drives people's behavior much more than the threat. And if you want to look for evidence of that, you can look for the difference in the murder rate between the United Kingdom and the United States. In the United Kingdom, we do not have execution for murder. In the United States, they do. There are many, many, many times more murders in the United States than the UK. So it cannot be the case that putting a bigger deterrence on itself changes people's behavior. What changes behavior is their understanding of their own value, their society, what matters to them. And as we educate people and inform people, that is what changes behavior. So these three myths, that regulation is covering everything, that inspection works, that deterrence motivates. As I've been working in this field, these are the three things that really have come to my attention and the evidence behind them. So why do I say that regulation is an asset if I also believe those three myths? And that's where I'd like to just move on to, if I may. I think regulation is more than an asset, a necessity, if I may, because without it, we cannot have a functioning society. We cannot have a society that works for the benefit of people without regulation. And by regulation here, I should say that I mean the combination of regulatory policy and regulatory delivery. So my work as an inspector, as a regulator, has largely been in the area of delivery, meeting with business, carrying out inspections, carrying out tests, encouraging them to change their behavior, using sanctions, making a move towards a more compliant society. But that isn't enough on its own. You can't apply very bad laws and get great outcomes. You need to have good laws. So for those involved in the legal system, for those involved in policy, for those who want a career in government, it's very important that you work on getting good laws. And a lot of the work of the reform program that is carrying on here in Indonesia with our colleagues that you've just heard from, but also in other parts of ASEAN, is about making laws better. How do we do good lawmaking? How do we consult well? How do we measure the impact of regulation well? How do we have a good framework in which we bring the law forward? So it's right to have a good framework, but it's also necessary to have good delivery. You can have good laws badly delivered, and that doesn't work. And you can have bad laws well delivered, and that doesn't really work. What you need is good law and good delivery. And that's what we should work for. And that's what your reform program here in Indonesia is working for, both policy and delivery. And if you take those two together, I call that our regulatory asset. And it's that we should steward as participants in civil society, in the civil service, in ministries, and in government more generally. We should steward that. We should value it. We should encourage people to value it. We should encourage ministers to value it. We should also encourage civil society to value it. The standard of living that you have here in Indonesia is based on a very good set of law, well interpreted and well delivered. Similarly in the UK. And we live with the benefit of that day in, day out. And I should try and explain why I believe that to be true. The first thing is that regulation is necessary for commerce. You cannot have a commercial society, an interaction of buying and selling, unless you have good regulation. If I say to you, who will buy this pile of food, this pile of product? Who will buy this? How much will you pay me for it? What's your first question? How much is there? I say, I've got a pile. You don't need to know how much. Just give me a price for this pile of food. And you say, well, how much is it? Is it 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms, 200 kilograms? No, you don't need to know that. You just need to know it's some stuff. Now tell me how much you'll pay. And we cannot have that conversation. You have to know how much is it? What quality is it? What durability does it have? What energy value does it have? And only when we know those things, when we can describe those things, can we start to transact. And you say, you'll pay me this much. And I say, no, I want twice as much. And eventually we might get a deal. Well, all of those things are framed upon regulation. How much is there? How do we measure it? How do we know if it's true? What is the quality of it? What is the energy value? What is the description? What is the durability? They are all things that need to be regulated. If I tell you it's 100 kilograms, because I weighed it on my scale, which is wrong, and you take it home and weigh it on your scale and find it was 50 kilograms, because you've got a better scale, are you going to be happy? I don't think so, because you've only got half what you paid for. So somebody needs to regulate that scale and make sure that scale is accurate. And so the whole of commerce is based upon good regulation. And principally, we call that the national quality infrastructure. And by that, we mean standards, accreditation, and metrology. And those three pillars form the national quality infrastructure. And without that, we cannot have regulation. We cannot have commerce. We need regulation of those fundamentals to achieve that. And there was a famous Scottish economist of the 18th century who was known as Adam Smith. And he's known as the father of the free markets. And people think he was against regulation. And he said, get rid of all the rules and let people just live. Free markets will take us to wealth. Well, actually, he said, without necessary regulation, there is no possibility of a liberal society. In other words, you need regulation for commerce. Beyond that, you need regulation for just the simple basics of how we live in society. You've probably all read novels where all the rules are taken away and what happens to the people in that novel. There's a famous one in England called Lord of the Flies. And I was made to study that at school when I was 18 or so. And in that, boys who are very posh and very well spoken, and they're wearing their suits like this, they are put on a desert island. And within a week, they're running around, stabbing each other and killing each other and causing mayhem. Until eventually, when they're desperate, a figure from the Royal Navy appears in his beautiful white suit. And he says, "Here I am. I represent regulation." And they'll go, "Oh, thank you. Finally, we have society." And you cannot have society without order. Who is allowed to speak? Who is trusted? Who is allowed to make decisions? Who gets elected to Parliament? Who trusts that Parliament will deliver for the people? These are all parts of society, and they come with a form of regulation. So commerce absolutely is based on regulation. We cannot have commerce without regulation. But more than that, society itself, I would argue, is based on forms of regulation. And often we take those for granted. You might say, "Well, I don't think so. We just live a happy life here." Well, that's because over the years, you have established a form of regulation, a form of democracy, a form of parliamentary supremacy, which enables those things to happen. And then we take them for granted. We expect the bus to come on time. We expect the food to be in the shops. We expect all these things to happen, but they happen because there is an underpinning of regulation. In England, we don't have a planned economy. And there's a famous story of a senior Russian minister who was a minister in the army. And he came to London and he observed how it worked with the shops and with people scurrying here and there, very much like as I've seen it, Jakarta. And he saw all this happening. And he said, "Wow, this is a marvel of planning. This is unbelievably good planning. Everybody is fed, everybody gets to work, everyone is clothed. Who organizes the bread distribution in London? They're a genius." And the truth is, nobody organizes the bread distribution in London. It is a market that is regulated and there is confidence in the market, but nobody organizes it. There is no clever person sitting in London saying, "Send 500 loaves to that shop, 200 to that shop, transfer that to that shop. Don't let people buy." No. People open shops because they have to see demand. People go to shops because they see supply. There is no regulation other than the effective framework on which people then come to depend. So we can see that good regulation is necessary, but also is enabling for good society. And then the third way in which regulation is necessary is for trade itself, for buying and selling. So commerce is underpinned by that confidence that enables us to buy and sell. And so we talk a lot in the dialogue between the UK and Indonesia about trade and about exports and about what we want to put into the supply chain to Indonesia from the UK and to the UK from Indonesia. But all of that is based on a framework of confidence that we've established together. And the word confidence is really important. Fundamentally, what regulation is creating is confidence. I want to trust all of you. You look like nice people. The people on Zoom are particularly nice people. I can't see you, but I have even more belief that you are nice. But am I right? You might all be charlatans. You might not be lawyers at all. You might just be people who wanted a bit of lunch and came in off the street. How do I know? I need to have trust with you, but that trust needs to be based on something. It needs to be based on a reciprocal give and exchange of information, which builds confidence. And that's what regulation enables. As we work together, as we converse together, as we make arrangements together, as we build on that, we build trust. So you've probably got a favorite shop where you go for your basic supplies. You've probably got a favorite shop where you go for these beautiful batik shirts. I don't know what those favorite shops are because I've just arrived here. But you know, you have a knowledge that is based on years of experience, trust that you've built up, you and your family and your friends. We always go there. They will not let us down. And even if they do let you down in a way, you'll say, "Oh, that's okay, because I know they're good people." So trust builds upon that framework to enable a greater level of confidence. And a greater level of confidence frees up a greater level of investment, and a greater level of investment frees up more trade, more innovation, more exports. So all of those things come from that fundamental framework that we start with. So all of that leads me to suggest that regulation is necessary. But more than that, we have to understand why it is necessary. What are the outcomes that regulation is seeking to achieve? And this is where, if I give this talk, I usually fall out with inspectors. If I say to an inspector, what is the purpose of your job? They will say to me, I inspect for food safety. And I say, why do you inspect for food safety? And they say, because Regulation 452, acted under Command 457, passed under the Job Creation Law of Indonesia 2023 or 22, has mandated me to inspect for food safety. And I say, wow, but why do you do that? And they look at me like I'm an idiot. And they say, oh, it's because he's English. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So they say to me again, I regulate under Regulation 457 of the so-and-so and so-and-so as mandated under the Job Creation Law of Indonesia. And I say, and why do you do that? And the truth is that we don't do things because there's a law. There is a law that we enforce because we want things. And regulation is for a purpose. Regulation is for an outcome. And if we don't know what the outcome is, simply enforcing the law will not get us any closer to the outcome that we're looking for. And the challenge for regulators is that the outcome is often a long way away from the activity. So I'll give you an example from the UK. In the UK, we are very conscious of the effect of smoking on health for the individual, early death, the cost for the health service. So smoking is seen as being an unhealthy thing. And so particularly, we reason that if children don't start smoking, it's less likely that adults will smoke. So we pass a law that says shops may not sell cigarettes to children. It's against the law for a shop to sell a cigarette to a child. And so my job when I was an inspector was I would send children into shops with a little bit of money, and they would say, can I have some cigarettes, please? And the shopkeeper would say, are you 18? And they would say, yes. And the shopkeeper would sell them cigarettes. And then we would take that shopkeeper to court because you're not allowed to sell cigarettes to children. And just because they say, I am 18, really, doesn't make them 18. Have you checked their ID? Have you checked that they are 18? Now, if you say to me, why do you do all of that? I say, because there's a law that bans the sale of cigarettes to children. But why do I do that? I do that because I believe that if children cannot buy cigarettes, it is less likely they will start to smoke. If children do not start to smoke, it's less likely they will have a habit. It's very hard to stop that habit as an adult. I'm sure some of you have smoked, and some of you are probably still trying to stop smoking. It's very hard to kick the habit when you're an adult. So try not to start when you're a child. So if we stop cigarettes being sold to children, then we can hopefully stop people getting a habit, and we can stop people smoking so much. And if we stop people smoking so much, fewer people will get lung cancer. And if fewer people have got lung cancer, there will be more people enjoying a high quality of life. And that will be good for them. It will also mean they live for longer, which will be good for them and their family. It also means they won't be in hospital so much, which will reduce the costs on the health service. And it means that they will have longer, happier and healthier lives, and society will be better. That's why we stop cigarettes being sold to children. So when I send that child into the shop, am I thinking Regulation 498 of the Omnibus Job Creation Law 2023, or am I thinking fewer people dying of lung cancer in 40 years' time? And that's the outcome of regulation. And what we need to be thinking about is, are we achieving the outcome? And the challenge is, it's a long way between the activity and the outcome. It's very hard to draw a causal link between this work here and that outcome. It's also difficult because there is more than one outcome from regulation. So if we just stick with that example of the cigarettes, then yes, we are stopping the child buying the cigarettes. We're also educating the children. So the children who work with me on that campaign now know a little bit more about why smoking is dangerous. Hopefully, we're also educating the shopkeeper about how laws work and about the importance of selling the right things to the right people and not simply thinking about money, but thinking about their contribution. And if they want to build a business that's going to be there for the long term, where people are going to trust them and come into their shop, then they need to be thinking not just about how much money can I get, but how can I build confidence with my with my customers. And we're also contributing to wider society in thinking about if they see a child go into a shop and buy cigarettes, do they say something? Do they tell the inspector? Do they say to the shop, you shouldn't have sold that to somebody? I remember I was in a queue behind a child in a shop after I'd finished that job, and they sold some fireworks to the person in front of me. And I said, oh, do you think that person was 18? And they said, what's it got to do with you? And I said, well, I just don't think you should sell fireworks to people who aren't 18. Who knows what they might do with them? But we can have a civil society contribution to those better outcomes. So it's not just about the narrow outcome, it's about those broad outcomes. We're responsible for the safety of refrigerators in the UK. So when I'm thinking about refrigerators, what do you think I'm thinking about? I regulate these things. What do you think I think about? What do you think should be at the top of my mind? Well, number one, sometimes refrigerators catch fire. They have a look. It's funny, isn't it? They're cold, but actually they catch fire because they've got electrical items and they catch fire, and they've got quite a lot of flammable material in them. So a refrigerator fire can become a house fire very quickly. And in the UK, we had a block of flats caught fire because of one electrical item, and 72 people died in that fire. So we think a lot about fire. But is that the only thing I think about? Well, also that refrigerator is contributing to energy usage, carbon, global warming, climate change. So we think about what is the gas that's making that refrigerator cold? What is the energy consumption of that refrigerator? How much energy is it putting out into the room? How much noise is it making? So we think about quite a lot of its environmental impacts. And unfortunately, those two things can go against each other. So in the UK, this is one of the things we got wrong. I've told you quite a lot already. I'll tell you another one. We get a lot wrong. We made fridges much more environmentally friendly. We changed the gas to be not ozone contributing. We changed the construction of the condenser and the circuits to be less energy consumptive. So we made them a lot more environmentally friendly. Great, win. However, they also started catching fire a lot more because the capacitors were now burning out, because the gas we were using in place of the ozone gas was actually flammable, because we could put everything closer together so that when there was a spark, it caught fire quicker. And so now we had a load of refrigerator fires. So we changed the law back again. And so if we're not careful, we make life impossible for business. And what we need to do is design a refrigerator that is both safe and environmentally friendly. Job done. However, now we have this wonderful idea. I don't know if it's caught on in Indonesia yet, but it's a great idea in the UK at least, where your refrigerator is connected to the internet. So this concept of the Internet of Things. So your refrigerator is not just a refrigerator plugged into the mains, but it's also connected by Wi-Fi to the internet. So when you use some meat, the refrigerator knows you've used the meat and it places an order in the shop. And the next time you go to the shop, you say, oh, you need some meat. Your fridge told me. And in fact, I could get it delivered for you. So now the Internet of Things means that I'd have to worry. And even I can open the fridge and it will tell me you have 4 eggs, some cheese, a little bit of butter. You could make an omelette. Ta-da! And so this is a wonderful thing. Apparently, I joke, but apparently this is a wonderful thing. However, I've now got an internet-connected fridge. And unfortunately, once I connect something to the internet, I get issues of security and safety of the cybersecurity. So now it's not just enough that my fridge won't catch fire, it won't destroy the planet, but also it won't unlock all my internet secrets to someone who might be spying on me. So now I have to make sure the fridge is safe, environmentally friendly, and cyber secure. And you might say, well, that's a bit flippant, but actually gradually we're moving to a more cyber connected world and all of our products. So who's got a Fitbit or Apple Watch or something like that on? I know you have, Joanna. Yeah, over there. There we are. So all of you are being tracked by someone in the cyber world. They don't only know where you are, they know whether you're sitting still. They know if you fell asleep. So at the end of this lecture, I will get a list, not just of who was here, but how often they were asleep. Because your phone knows if you're sleeping. It's tracking you as you sleep. And then it's telling the lecturer, he might have showed up, but was he awake? Was he listening? So all of this data is being gathered about us all the time. And somebody needs to be responsible for making sure. And so regulation is always thinking about more than one outcome. It's thinking about more than one benefit. I would like to suggest it's thinking about benefits in ways that are good for society and good for people. I hope so. But actually, we need to make sure it is. It's not just enough to hope. We have to make sure that regulation is working for us. So for me, regulation is an asset. It can be a good thing, but it will only be a good thing if it is targeted, if it is proportionate, and if it is measured. So measuring the weight of regulation, the impact of regulation, the effect of regulation is fundamental. I'm drawing to a close now because I want to have time to have questions, but I want to leave with you 6 things that we can do to improve the way we regulate. And I've been in Indonesia now for a week. My team have been here for 5 years, and we've been working particularly with the CMEA on risk-based approaches. So that's one of the really important things. But let me start at the beginning. 6 things that we need to do to regulate better. The first is that we need to have a very good governance framework. This means a good approach to law, to powers, to structures, and to mapping. How do the ministries work together? So I'm going to give you some numbers and you can tell me if I get any of these wrong. In Indonesia, there are 18 line ministries and a number of coordinating ministries. And those 18 line ministries all regulate. And so they have to think about how they work together. It's not enough to think about just our outcomes. We need to think about together. We need a framework of how we think together. The coordinating ministries are responsible for that in many ways. So how do they do their job? But also, now let me see if I've got these numbers right. There are 38 provinces. Is that right? I think it's 38 provinces. And each of those provinces has regulatory responsibilities. So how do they work together to make up the whole of Indonesia? But also, how do they work with the ministries? And how do they work with the districts? And I think there's 650 districts, although that number I think has grown since last year. So a lot of districts, all of whom do delivery. So first of all, governance. How does all of that work? Now, is there anyone in this room who could draw me a simple map of how that works? If I got a flip chart here, could anyone draw me a simple map of how that works? And I don't think you could because it's complicated. I could draw you a map of the UK because I spent a number of years studying it, but I couldn't draw you a map of Indonesia. And yet you need to be able to do that. You need to have a simple picture of how it works. And it needs to be effective. It needs to be targeted on the benefits to citizens and the simplicity for business. So first question, do we have the right regulatory governance in place? And that's a challenge for any country. Second question, are regulators accountable? So what do we mean by accountable? We mean, do they listen and do they respond? Do they listen and respond to business? Do they listen and respond to consumers and civil society? So how many of you here would feel confident to go to a regulator and say, you should change what you do? Would they listen to you? Would they hear what you said? Would they change because of it? Are they accountable to you? Or do they simply impose their power upon you? So that's the second question. Third question, what is the culture of regulators? And by culture, I mean the values, the leadership, the competency that the regulators have. What is the values that the regulator uses? Are they openness and transparency? I went on an inspection yesterday at the food with the health ministry, and there was a lovely transparency where they spoke to the business and the business responded, and there was an open dialogue. And I thought that was a real asset. You wouldn't always see that in the United Kingdom. We saw that there in that. It was really good. A culture that said, I value what you have to say, and you will listen to what I have to say, and we'll have dialogue together. So first of all, governance. Secondly, accountability. Thirdly, culture. And then 3 more. One is a risk-based approach. And this is what's being developed in Indonesia through the OSS, the online licensing application system. And what it does is it takes data and measures the risk. And it says not all businesses create the same risk. It can be high, high, upper medium, lower medium, or low. 4 categories. And if you're a high risk business, then you will get more of a regime around licensing, more inspection. But if you're a low risk business, you can simply say, this is my business, and you can get on with it. You can carry on without interference. So it's based on risk, and it's measured according to risk, and it's measured according to the hazard that that sector creates. Then we think about the interventions that we choose. A regulator does not only have licensing and inspection, they also have education, awareness, empowerment, sanctions, incentives, behavioral insights. There are many things a regulator can do to change behavior. There's a famous phrase, I think it's an American phrase, and it says, if the only weapon you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Yeah? If the only thing you have in your hand is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail because you have to hit it. And not everything responds to being hit. You need a screwdriver and a saw and a chisel and a plane and all the other tools of a craftsman. And so an inspector needs all the tools of a craftsman and applying them to the right situation and doing them correctly. If you only got one, inspection or licensing, then you whack, 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 but it may not work because actually you need a different set of tools. So number 5, what are the choices available to you? And then number 6, what are the outcomes you're working for and how will you measure your progress towards them? Because it's a well-known phrase, if you don't know where you're going, you definitely won't get there. You have to know when you start on a journey, what is the outcome of this journey? Where am I hoping to get to with this journey? How will I know if I've got there? And it's the same with regulation. I have to know the purpose and we have to know how we're going to measure our progress towards it. And your reform journey here is based on a really good map of where we're going and how we'll know if we get there. And that's really important. So 6 things to leave with you. Have we got the right governance? Have we got the right accountability? Have we got a good culture? Do we use risk to target our priorities? Have we got a good range of interventions? And have we got a measurement of where we're going and whether we've got there? That's all I wanted to say to you. I hope that's helpful. I hope it's convinced you that regulation is and can be an asset. More than that, it's a necessity. Without it, we can't have good society. But if we do it well, we actually drive a whole load of outcomes that really matter. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. And now we have now around 20-30 minutes for Q&A session. Is there any question here or from Zoom? And you can ask question either in English or Bahasa Indonesia. If you ask question in Bahasa Indonesia, you can ask the question, and after that, the interpreter will translate it into English. Silakan. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Terima kasih. I think because the interpreter is standing, sit very way in the back, I will decide to make my question in English. Okay, I am very interested, Mr. Russell, about your statement about sanction will not deter behavior and will not change behavior, basically. So I think there is a need to find creative way to convince people to change their behavior, not only by imposing sanction, not only by criminalizing the certain behavior. So I think that comes to a question: how do you think is the best way for a regulation to change behavior, to change because you say that sanction will not bring deterrence because people will not automatically comply. They will only probably find another way to do it, and etc. So I think how is government should do to create creative way to change behavior on at least on what is your experience on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question. Can I just check with the interpreter that you can hear me all right if I sit here? Okay. So thank you for the question. The evidence from many studies is that deterrence does not change long-term behavior. It will sometimes cause people to change short-term behavior. It will sometimes cause people to adopt gaming strategies and alternative ways of getting their ends without coming into conflict with the law. But what it won't do is it won't change their fundamental behavior.
Does that mean we shouldn't have sanctions? No, it does not mean that, because sanctions are fundamental to the way in which we frame our law. They're important for people who do invest in compliance to see a benefit from investment, and they are the external framing of the law. And without sanctions, then the law would not work in the way that we use it in civil society. However, what we mustn't do is think that simply having sanctions will achieve our ends. So for those who were there on Tuesday when we spoke at the event, I'm going to say something I said there, so my apologies for repeating that. But for me, you've got to understand why the non-compliance occurs. So when we say risk, we talk about hazard, what could go wrong, and likelihood, how likely is it that it will go wrong? And likelihood is around the failure of the person, the company, the individual, the corporate entity to do the right thing. And that likelihood is driven by one of three. Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. One of three things. It might be because the person does not know or is not able to comply with the law. They are incompetent. Now, we would never say you are incompetent, but they are incompetent. They do not have the ability to comply with the law. The second reason is they know what the law is and they could do it if they wanted to, but they don't care. They don't think it's important enough to change their behavior. And the third is that their whole business model is predicated on not complying with the law. They will not comply with the law because if they complied with the law, their business would not function. They are involved in intellectual property. They're involved in supply of drugs. They are doing something that is illegal. And those are the three fundamental reasons why people don't comply with the law. And your response depends on their reason. So if they are incompetent or ignorant, you explain the law to them, you build up their capability, you encourage them to get it right, and you give them the tools to get it right. And if that was their reason for not doing it, they will do it. Once you enable them to do it, they will do it. So if I'm driving along the road and the speed limit is 30 kilometers an hour and I have no speedometer and I'm driving at 40, then you need to give me a speedometer. If I haven't got a speedometer, how do I know my speed? How can I drive at the right speed? So I'm ignorant. Now, of course, that's still illegal, but the solution is to give me a speedometer. Yeah? If I am capable of complying with the law, but I just don't, because I don't think it matters, I see the speedometer, it's here, it's there, I just drive anyway, I don't care, then you have to encourage my incentive to comply. You have to give me reasons why it matters. Explain to me that I'm putting people's lives at risk. Explain to me that traffic will flow better if everyone goes at the right speed. Explain to me those things. Give me incentives. Give me understanding. Bring me into the community of society. However, if my job is a taxi driver and I've committed to get from here to there at a speed of 60 miles an hour, and I've taken a contract based on driving at 60 in the 30-mile-an-hour zone, then giving me a speedometer, giving me awareness, giving me education will not make me comply with the law. You're going to have to stop me, take the car away, take my license away, suspend me, because otherwise I will just do it, because that is my business. So there is a purpose in sanctions, but it's where that criminality is the motivating factor. So understand why the non-compliance occurs and then tune your response to the non-compliance. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Next question.
Siapa berikutnya? Halo?
Oh, they do.
Yeah, before we go to online question, we can hear a question here. Okay. Okay. Okay, there's Pak Yunus Hussein. He's a senior lecturer at Indonesia Jenderal School of Law and also University of Indonesia. Silakan Pak Yunus.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your excellent presentation, Excellency. I have two questions about the regulation. First one, related to the good regulatory governance. What do you mean by good regulatory governance? Maybe any element should be made to be called as a good regulatory governance. The second one related to many interests should be regulated. Interest of the market, for example, government and other interest party. How to strike the balance between different stakeholder when we make a regulation? How to make a strike balance? How to strike a good balance between different stakeholder? Because this is very difficult to strike the good balance between any other stakeholder. Thank you. That's all my question, only two.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your question. I hope you can both see and hear okay, and I will try and address myself to those two questions. First of all, good regulatory governance. I think there's a narrow answer and a broader answer, if I may be so bold. The narrow answer is, how do we make laws well? And we make laws well by good policy making. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thank you very much, guys. There's some fiddling going on with the technology at the back, so I think they're under control. Well done. Thank you, gentlemen. So what does it mean to have good lawmaking? And good lawmaking is based on a number of principles. There is a principle of transparency. There is a principle of accountability. There is a principle of consultation. And these are things that are not just, they're important for more than one reason. One is that we get better laws if we make laws transparently and carefully in accordance with the framework of lawmaking. We get better outcomes from that. If we measure impact through regulatory impact assessment, if we consult well with stakeholders, if we take time to be transparent about what the law is, then we will have better law. And what we know is that people are more likely to comply if the law is well-founded. One of the things that drives people to compliance is a feeling that the law is something that they're part of, not something imposed on them from outside, but something they've been part of through participative process. So in the UK, we have things like mandatory consultation periods. We have fixed implementation dates. A ministry can't just make a law today and bring it in tomorrow. They have to consult for a period of time. Then there's a period where people get to understand it. Then there is a certain date when it will be brought into law. So by the time it's brought into law, there's already guidance, understanding, support, all those things that make good law. And so good regulatory governance in that sense, those principles, good policy making, evidence-based policy making are really important for the law being complied with. But as I tried to imply earlier, I don't think good regulatory governance is only about making good laws. It's also about institutions being well structured, having the right powers, the right checks and balances, the right internal and external relationships. And for me, those are also part of good regulatory governance. If we construct a new regulator and we say, here is a job, go and do it. So in the UK this week, it was announced there will be a new regulator for football teams. All football teams will in future be regulated. Well, how does that regulator relate to the financial regulator, the credit regulator, the public safety regulator, the food safety regulator, the sports grounds regulator? There's many regulators. How do they work together? What are the boundaries of their responsibilities? How do we avoid overlap? How will they be risk-based? Does Manchester United get more or less regulatory involvement than my other team, which is called Port Vale, that none of you have heard of? And how do we proportionally measure the risk from those activities? So all of that is part of the regulatory governance framework. And then turning to your second question, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, sorry. I don't like the use of the word balance in that sentence. I think if we think about our job as balancing competing interests, then we are setting up a conflict where somebody wins and somebody loses. For me, our first responsibility in policy making or in regulation should be to find a space where everybody can win. So what is it that you're looking for from this context? And what is it that you're looking for? And where do we have a shared objective? And let's focus on that shared objective and let's make that our prime goal. Now, that doesn't mean we get rid of all the conflicts. There are conflicts, of course, but we start by thinking about how we can win together. So if I'm asked, for example, is regulation always inhibiting growth? I start by saying, as I did today, no, good regulation can encourage growth in these ways. Now, if you want to construct an illegal mine in a sensitive natural environment and destroy the watercourse, then we probably are going to be in conflict, because it's probably hard to find a lot of common ground between us. But let's not start there. Let's start by saying, where in Indonesia could there be a mine that exploited natural resources, brought in wealth into the economy, employed people, but didn't harm sensitive environments, didn't cause a loss of diversity? Where could we do that in ways that drove our better outcomes rather than focusing solely on that conflict? So the word balance for me, and I'll let you come back on this if you think I'm being totally unhelpful, but the word balance for me is not the word I want to start with. I want to start with the word outcomes and shared outcomes. And let's work from there towards things that are going to take us forward. So our colleague has gone off the screen, which might mean he's happy, but if he wants to come back on with another question, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, I'll go to the left.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Yunus, for the question. Next question.
Hi, Graham. Graham, you said before that to regulate risk-based approach in the context in Indonesia is we are just starting the new reformation, risk-based licensing. But you said before that to measure the risk we need certain data. But actually in Indonesia, as I know that when we start the reformation of risk-based licensing, we only measures the data by use professional judgment, not by adequate data. So I just want to ask you how you do this in UK, how you measure the risk by the data and how you manage the data. Do you evaluate the risk in certain maybe five years or how? That's all. Thank you.
This is probably one of the hardest things to do. And it's one of the things we're still working on. And I think we'll always be working on. So one of the things I say is that if you're a regulator, you should put 25% of your human resources and your financial resources into data and measuring risk. Instead of having lots of inspectors running around, it's better to have lots of people thinking and guiding the activities of the inspector, because getting this right is not a simple job. Second thing I would say is that there are two things you're trying to measure. The first thing you're trying to measure is the hazard within the sector, within the industry, within the business. And by and large, this is measurable. It's based on facts, the number of events, the number of injuries, the number of accidents, the number of events that occur. And those things can be measured. They're not easy to measure, but they can be measured. And you can look across the sector and you can use international comparisons and you can use historical data, and then you can refine that and make it more accurate for Indonesia over time. But you can start with fairly common big picture numbers. And so that is what you've been doing in creation of the OSS, putting people into sectors, saying this sector is more hazardous than this sector, and so you align them. And from what I understand, that's gone pretty well. The second part of risk is likelihood of non-compliance. And in some ways, this is harder to measure. It's more subjective. It's more based on professional judgment. And I think at the moment, the OSS doesn't use this as much. And I think that's right, because this will need to develop over time. Because at the same time as you're using a more sophisticated system, you also need more sophisticated operators. So the training of the frontline officers, the inspectors in the districts, in the provinces, in the ministries, has to come alongside the development of the OSS system. And as you do that, so you can empower those inspectors. So if an inspector goes and says, I did a health inspection and I found this level of non-compliance, if you have confidence they've done a good piece of work and that's transferable and measurable, you can apply that to that company's performance. And you can say they are likely to be good in all their other areas, or they are likely to be less good in all their other areas, because there is very good data that says a company's attitude and capability of compliance is pretty consistent. There is one distinction, which is that some companies have more compliance in their citizen-facing activity and less compliance in their back office activity. There is some evidence for that. But generally speaking, the evidence is that people are consistent in their capability and their attitude to compliance. So you can take data from the health area and apply it to the food area, the environmental area, the tax area, the labour law area. You can apply it right across the piece. So you can use data on compliance rates, likelihood of compliance rates fairly well, but it still remains subjective for the reasons you said. So we have two components. And then I think the third thing is data sharing. And it is imperative that we work hard on sharing data, particularly between line ministries. And line ministries don't find it easy to share data. They tend to own their data fairly carefully and fairly conservatively. And so I say to people, why do you not share data? And they say to me, it's against the law, it's not possible with the technology, or we don't want to. And really and truly, you can pass a law that makes it possible. And I know you've passed some laws here. You can solve the data problems through technology and data warehousing and internet scraping. And there's all sorts of clever ways of getting the data to be shared. But the bit you struggle with is this bit. People don't like sharing data because they feel their data is powerful and valuable. And of course it is. But it's more powerful and more valuable if it's shared. So encouraging people on that journey to sharing data, to driving better risk assessments. The more data you have, the better your risk assessment, the better your outcomes. And so it's really good to have lots of data, but it's a journey that you need to take people on. And again, I go back to my point about trust and confidence. Why should I share my data with you? I need to know that you're going to respect it. I need to know that we're working towards common aims. I need to know that you value me as I value you. So it's that culture that will ultimately underpin whether we share data. So you're right in your question, but we've got to approach it through those three ways and really focus on it and give resource to it and time to it.
Is there any more question from here before we go to Zoom? All right. There are two questions from Zoom. It's from Frida Graham. The first one is regulations in Indonesia are very often found more as a fire engine when problems are burning in society than as anticipatory actions. How good quality regulation can be developed in this situation? And the second one is...
Should I do one at a time? Is that okay?
It's okay.
So
It's okay.
Just read it again so I get it exactly right.
Yes.
Yeah, read it again for me.
All right. In Indonesia, regulations are very often found more as a fire engine when problems are burning in society than as anticipatory actions. How good quality regulation can be developed in this situation?
And who's that come from?
It's Frida.
It's a good question.
All right. And there's another question actually.
I'll do that one. I'll do it quickly.
Sure.
I know we're running out of time, but I'll be quick. How do you make regulation an anticipatory and a precautionary approach rather than a firefighting after the event approach? Brilliant question. And I think in Indonesia, you are actually doing better on this than you think. I think the approach you have with licensing and risk-based licensing is very conducive to preventative activity. And I would encourage you in that direction. I would also encourage you to think about when it's appropriate and when it isn't appropriate. But generally speaking, a licensing environment is the one that most prevents things going wrong further down the track. The problem is it can be costly because everybody is subject to the same environment, but you've approached that through your risk-based approach. More generally, the challenge is to get politicians to think forward. And I say this respectfully. I have a lot of respect for politicians, and obviously they're in charge of creating our laws and the environment in which we work. But often the political process can create short-term incentives. And what we want is long-term, precautionary and predictive legislation. So working with our ministers to think about what's going to work in the long term, what is going to create the incentives for compliance. I was in front of a parliamentary committee in the UK government, and I was being asked at what I'd done and what we did and how we did it and why we weren't better. And they said to me, will you tell me, Mr. Russell, how many goods you checked last year at the ports of entry into the UK? How many checks did you make? And I said, well, we make a lot of checks in accordance with a risk-based approach, targeted on the areas of least compliance, looking at a sophisticated model based on data, drawn upon international best practice, blah, blah, and I spoke for a long time. And eventually I stopped. And the MP asked me, yes, but you haven't said how many did you do? And I said, well, we take a very much a precautionary approach and it's very targeted and based and so on. And she said, you're not going to tell me, are you? And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you for two reasons. One is because that would not help the overall approach. It's important that people understand that we have an effective border. And if I say to you on Tuesday afternoons, I check 25 things, and on Wednesday mornings, I check 10 things, then we'll have people playing games with the system and trying to evade the system. But actually, it's important that people understand there is a system. And so the precautionary approach is to create that environment, an environment of detection and deterrence and disturbance, rather than a very, this will be checked, this won't be checked. So she didn't agree with me, unfortunately, and she was very cross that I wouldn't answer her question. But to me, we need to, if I'd had time one-to-one with her, I would have said, look, I want to create an environment where people don't want to bring illegal things into the UK. I don't want to create an environment where I occasionally catch them, because if I've caught somebody, I've missed somebody. I want to create an environment where people don't bring things in. So I'm trying to change the environment, don't give me £5 more to do one more check, but give me more money to work with people to create an environment where they don't try and break the law. Second question. That's my best go at the first question.
This is a very interesting question. This is from Jenny. How do you think a nation's culture might be connected to the obedience to the regulation or law?
How do I think the nation's culture might be connected to obedience with the law? That's a great question, isn't it? Yeah. Why don't you answer that question? You're the expert. You know a lot more about Indonesian culture than me. I'll talk about the UK. You can talk about Indonesia. I'd be very not talking about Indonesian culture after 1 week. What I know in the UK is that what drives obedience with the law, compliance with the law, is whether there is social acceptance of that legislation. So let me tell you a story. In 1963, I was born. It was a very important year. 1963, I was born. Two other things happened in 1963 in the UK. We passed two laws. One law said you must pay men and women the same for the same job. Equal pay for equal work. And the other law said you must wear a crash helmet when you ride on a motorcycle. Those laws were both passed in 1963. Also, I was born. Most important thing, I was born. Second most important thing, those two laws. Okay, it's now 59 years since I was born. I'll be 60 this year. If you want to come to my party, you're all invited. After 60 years, what is compliance with those two laws like? If you go out on the street, almost everybody is wearing a helmet on a motorcycle. One or two people may not, but 99.99999% of people is wearing a crash helmet when they ride a motorcycle in the UK. So we have very high compliance rates. If you look at pay for men and women, there's a roughly, I think it's around a 12% gap. It may be more in some companies, maybe less in others. Depends how you measure it, depends who you look at. But it's not equal. And it's not that women are being paid more than men. I'm sorry. There is a gap. So why has one law been complied with and the other law hasn't been complied with? Is it effective enforcement? Is it deterrence? Is it? No, it's social acceptance. We have not won the conversation that says men and women should be paid the same. There are still people who think they can pay women less than men for the same job. We have not won the behavior. Whereas we have won the behavior over motorcycle helmets. Very few people get stopped by the police for not wearing a helmet. The police don't have the time or the resources to do that. People wear helmets because they believe they'll be safer if they wear a helmet. They don't pay women the same as men because they believe that's not what they have to do. So the reason why we have compliance is to do with social culture. And if we want to win the battle and pay women the same as men, then we have to educate, inform. And we are making progress. The gap is smaller. And we've just done a new thing in the UK where we now publish data for big businesses. We have a name and shame approach. So if people don't pay women the same as men, they get named. We're trying to out the bad behavior. We're trying to change it that way. We're still working, but we haven't got there. Is that okay? In Indonesia?
Not today. Do you still have time for one more question? Okay. This is from Ratri, the final question. Sometimes regulatory reforms are likened to repairing cars while the engine is still running. How often does this regulatory adjustment are done in the UK? What is the process and how inclusive is this process?
So let me make sure I get that right. Regulatory reform is like trying to improve a car engine while it's still running. How often is that done in the UK? And how open is that process? Is that right? Okay.
The meaningful participation is also a big issue in Indonesia.
Meaningful. Okay, I will come to that. I'm just toying with the metaphor for a moment. It seems to me very dangerous to repair a car engine while it's running. Yes. I remember I'm looking at my finger. I remember when I was a child and I was trying to fix my pedal cycle and I had the wheel going round with the chain and I put my finger in and it got chewed up by the chain and I had to go to hospital to have it operated on. It was that finger. It was very painful. So I don't think that can be a good idea. That feels dangerous. However, you're right. The questioner is right. You cannot stop the economy while you reform. And there's two consequences to that I'm aware of. One is that business responds badly to change. There's a wonderful graph I saw that said, what are the costs of labor law in the United Kingdom, Germany, America, France, Italy? And America had very low labor costs, very easy to hire and fire people. Germany had relatively high labor costs, expensive to hire and fire people. But the highest cost was Britain, because we moved all the time, up and down, new laws, and Germany and America had much more stable environments. And so the biggest cost for business is change. So one of the things we should build into our regulatory reform program is a high cost to change. We should build a principles-based, outcome-based framework within which business can innovate without endless change in the laws. And I hope that would then help with the second part of the question, which is how can we be transparent and inclusive? And for me, being inclusive is probably a good point to finish this whole conversation. Because what drives good regulatory outcomes, what drives both good law and good compliance is largely around a sense of ownership, a sense of participation, a sense of being included. And for me, there's a clear parallel here, geographically, if I can say that, between UK and Indonesia. You have a complex geographical environment in Indonesia. I can see that just from the map. But we have a complex geographical environment in the UK, with this part of the UK wanting independence and this part of the UK still being subject to European law after we left the EU exit, and this part of the UK thinking it's different to that part, and this part speaking a different language to that part. And good law comes from inclusion and participation geographically, across genders, across disability, across race, across sexuality, across socioeconomic background, educational background, rurality, all of these things. We have to include people, whoever they are, wherever they are. And so within my organization, we say, bring your whole self to work every day. Be the best version of yourself that you can be. I can't be better at being you than you can. And you can't be better at being me than I can. But if we both do the best at being ourselves, then together we can have great outcomes. And that applies to me, in my family, in my work, and in society. So for me, it's a great place to finish. How do we encourage participation? How do we value people? How do we be inclusive? And if we have those fundamental principles at the heart of our lawmaking, at the heart of our delivery, we'll do a good job. You've been very patient with me. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for taking us through so carefully. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry you didn't answer my question, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. Please join me to give applause to Graham. Terima kasih, Pak Graham. Let me move back to this podium. Thank you very much, Pak Graham, for a very wonderful lecture. With this, we have come to the end of our lecture. Before we conclude our session today, I would like to invite the representatives from the UK Embassy, Ms. Zoe Dayan, Regulatory Reform and Health Attaché, who will kindly deliver her closing remarks. Ms. Zoe, the floor is yours.
You see, Graham is tall and I am not. I hope you found that a really interesting and stimulating lecture and question and discussion. I wanted to try and summarize, which is impossible, and I will only take 2 minutes, I promise. So I think what Graham was saying, policy and delivery is a necessity. It underpins the trust and confidence, which makes us feel safe to live here, to work, to trade, to earn money, to raise our children. But it has to be good regulation and well implemented. And I know that's what this school is all about. How do we make it work properly and effectively for the society we want to live in? I think his next point was that we have to keep our eye on the real goals. We all get so busy in parts of the job, drafting the regulation, thinking about the indicators for where will I visit next to inspect? How am I going to manage it? Is the OSS working? Where's the data that I have to report? We get so busy that we have to remember this is not about making and enforcing rules. It's about saving children or protecting the planet. We have to keep being able to come back to that real level. And we all work very hard at this. So we want to make it worthwhile. I feel better if that's what I'm doing, and I'm sure all of you do too. There's another thing about doing what we've done today, actually, which is talking and sharing and questioning. Graham, in your opening, you said confidence is based on shared information. And it occurred to me as you went through, we talked about consultation and the importance of inclusive consultation and at the right time and with the right information. Data exchange between regulators and between government and society so that we can focus on the important things. And even at the individual level, how an inspector works with a business to help them comply, to help them do the right thing. It's all about that interaction in the end, that sharing of work between us. And then the question where you ended, we came back round to the social acceptance. That was such a good question about the culture. It's about achieving a behavior. And normally if we're thinking about a new regulation, it's a change in behavior. It's not exactly what is happening all the time now. Otherwise we don't need to intervene. And yeah, we have to say the policy isn't the law. The law is part of the toolbox that a government can use to deliver the change that the policy wants. And it's that doesn't make the role of the lawmaker any less. It just makes it more important and more complicated to see how that fits in with all the things that have to be in place to make it work. So, Mr. Graham, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a fantastic lecture and afternoon. I have to say that because I work for him, but it was really. I hope you have all enjoyed it, and it has raised lots more questions that we can continue to discuss. Thank you so much, sir, for allowing us to come and share and have the dialogue. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for the wonderful closing. And the recording of today's lecture will be available in our YouTube channel, Sekolah Tinggi Hukum Indonesia Jentra, as for maybe tomorrow or next week. Yeah, tomorrow or next week. Once again, thank you. Terima kasih banyak. Selamat sore. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.